Great. Well, thank you, Chris, for inviting me to join you all this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here among so many people interested in Serres. So in the next 25 minutes, what I'm going to present to you is the thesis from the book I published last year, Paris and the Parasite, Noise, Health, and Politics in the Media City, and discuss how Serres' reflections on the parasite inform my understanding of the city as a political space, as an ecosystem, and as a media system. So I'll start by saying a bit about what I mean by the city as a media system. In 1988, Friedrich Kittler published The City as a Medium, an essay in which he defines media as technologies that, quote, record, transmit, and process information. And he argues that the city is just such a technology. So building on observations made by Louis Mumford in the 1960s, he says that walls and streets are channels comparable to the circuits of a computer. Kittler's notion of the city as medium has nourished two main branches of urban studies. The first seizes on this computational metaphor for the city, arguing that cities have undergone a revolution brought on by new telepresence technologies and virtual reality. Whereas the second, which I would say I'm much closer to, is less interested in silicon per se and more interested in the mediatic. Scott McQuire, the author of The Media City, summarizes this area of scholarship saying, quote, acceptance of the heightened role of media in the production of contemporary experience demands the critical embrace of Marshall McLuhan's insight that media constitute an environment. Moving through the world at large now involves the ongoing negotiation of and participation in diverse media flows. Neither home nor street nor city can now be thought apart from the media apparatus, which redistributes the scale and speed of social interaction in their domains. So this area of research is interested in how cities relate to and remediate other media technologies like writing, photography, and cinema. And it also has a much more copious understanding of what constitutes urban media, as evidenced by the title of Shannon Mattern's Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media. So it's interested in how everything in the built environment generates, transforms, and transmits information. I think you can already see how Serres' idea of objects as information producers might fit with this approach to the city. And I think thinking about city as media system also poses questions about relationality and the subjectivity of citizens that lends itself to Serres' work on communication. But what I think Serres brings to media city research that's most valuable is his interest in error, noise, and breakdowns. In recent years, urban studies and urban planning have generally moved away from centralized top-down thinking, partly motivated by post-colonial critiques of the authoritarian dimension of that tradition, and partly motivated by kind of libertarian hacker ethos. However, even very left-wing anarchist, decentralized approaches to the city still generally take it for granted that the city should work. Certain values like peace, quiet, order, efficiency continue to prevail. I mean, if you think of a term like city hacking, which activates this lexical field of catastrophic breakdown of the urban machine, in practice, it's usually presented as a way for citizens to just make the city work better for them. So there's this kind of blind spot around error, not as something to be eliminated, but as a constitutive part of the urban media system, as something that, borrowing from Mark Nunez, quote, reveals not only a system's failure, but its operational logic. So that's why I was initially drawn to Serres, and in particular to the Parasite. And the Parasite does not, of course, only concern noise. Serres draws on all four of the word's meanings in French. Peter said three, Larousse calls it four, adding the etymological meaning from the Greek parasitos, meaning one who eats alongside, and which originally referred to people from the lower classes who were allowed to share a table with the nobles at feasts. From that came the meaning of somebody who lives off other people's labor. And then in the 18th century, you get the biological meaning of an organism that lives in or off a host. So I would summarize these four meanings as hospitable, sociopolitical, biological, and mediatic. And part of Serres' argument, as you know, is that these four meanings are all connected. The parasite is a kind of assemblage whose form adapts to the system at hand. It thus allows us to talk about links between political, biological, and mediatic systems, and in the process to see how the disregard for noise in urban media theory and in planning is profoundly intertwined with public health and hygiene and with social politics. So I'll give you an example of this. In 2015, the municipal government of Paris announced a commitment to eliminate environmental noise from the city. The city's planners quickly ran into the problem of how to define noise. When I was on my year abroad in Paris as an undergrad, my neighbors were a couple of old alcoholic retirees who would have huge arguments in the evening, and to stop us from listening to them, they would blast classical music. And I think that we can all agree that that was a noise violation, but there's nothing in the sound waves that marks this out as noise. I mean, I don't think that we're going to say that Beethoven is the problem, although I do think that it's kind of funny that a British woman was arrested for listening to Ed Sheeran's Shape of You for 30 minutes on repeat, whereas a Slovakian woman got away with Verdi for 16 years before they arrested her. Anyway, the point of this is that noise is contextual and subjective. My neighbor's music was noise because I didn't want to hear it, because you might say we have a right to silence in our own private space if we want it. So already we're moving from a dispute about the media environment of the city to the domain of hospitality and neighborliness. And in the process, opening the can of worms that is the biases manifest in not in my backyard disputes. I mean, what if instead of Beethoven, they had been blasting Algerian rhyme music? Then my desire for the state to intervene would take on different ethical and sociopolitical connotations. You might be familiar with Jacques Chirac's 1991 speech, in which he notoriously declared that it was reasonable for French whites to hate immigrant neighbors on account of their bruit et odeur, their noise and odors. As Emile Benveniste reminds us, the word barbarian comes from barbaros, literally blah blah person, a foreigner whose language sounded like noise to the ancient Greeks, and in Greek law, a barbarian did not have a right to life. So it's easy to imagine noise ordinances becoming a mechanism for criminalizing minority neighbors. Now, the Paris government tried to sidestep these issues by insisting on another definition of noise. Sound becomes noise, they said, when it harms the body of the listener. The mayor's environmental deputy asserted that Europe was in the midst of a public health crisis with 10,000 deaths per year attributable to noise. You figure out that number on your own. And I think also the emphasis on noise in the environment helps with that framing, because it gives us the sense that noise is like smog. And so we're moving into the domain of biological parasitism with this. Of course, giving a physiological definition of noise doesn't completely insulate you from issues with inclusion and social justice. Most of the proposals in the document concerned commuting, which is a heated topic in Paris, given the racial and economic demographics of the banlieue or suburbs. And these promises to reduce traffic from the suburbs, unless counterbalanced by better public transport, can't help threaten banlieusage right to the city, to borrow from the Marxist urban theorist Henri Lefebvre. And so this image I used in my as my cover slide is a noise map of Paris. And you can see how the ring road around the city becomes this kind of wall of purple noise, symbolically reproducing the stone walls that used to mark the boundary between center and suburb. So I think this is a very good example of what Serres' work allows us to do with the city. It shows that when urban planners set out to eliminate noise, they're never just trying to eliminate one kind of parasite from the city. What starts as a question about the soundscape, about what sounds are desirable signal and what are pernicious noise, turns out to be a set of questions about private and public space, about language, identity, belonging, and about the health of the individual and the community. So in my book, I argue that Paris has been dominated by what I call anti-parasitic urbanism, by which I mean that its development has historically been oriented around the identification, pathologization, and attempted extermination of diverse parasites. Noise, disease, and a variety of human and non-human others are conceptually associated with one another and identified as the enemies of urban order and efficiency. This anti-parasitic urbanism manifests in all kinds of ways today, from the smart city model of urban planning, which imagines the city as an immense information processing system that can be rendered ever more efficient through new technological interventions, to policies that criminalize homelessness and make the city increasingly inaccessible to those who can't pay their way, to multi-million-pound crusades against rats. I know, if you had to picture the man who's trying to kill all the rats in New York City, this is what you would picture. So yeah, in all of these cases, you see this urge to exterminate or purge the supposedly undeserving, unproductive, inefficient other. And what I'd like to do in this talk is give you first a historical overview of how this anti-parasitic urbanism took hold in Paris over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, before discussing some examples of parasitism as a way of contesting the city in a more positive light. So yeah, I would not try to establish a precise date that marks the beginning of anti-parasitic urbanism in France, mindful of Serres' tendency in Le Parasite to leap from modernity to ancient Egypt and back again. But I think there are some key dates in the development of this ideology. The first is the advent of urbanism as a formal discipline at the turn of the 19th century, which coincided with the rise of public health thinking. Fears of national decline in the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat combined with the cholera epidemic to shape early urban planning in France. The government expanded the sewer system, created gardens, and constructed urinals. These efforts to cleanse the city of its biological parasites were inextricable from the vilification of people on the socio-political margins. Sang-Young Park writes, quote, "The need to sanitize and aerate the stagnant, unhygienic streets of the city's core was the flip side of a move to mitigate the insurrectionary impulses fomenting in working class neighborhoods," end quote. If you're familiar with Paris history, Walter Benjamin, this argument has, of course, also been made about Haussmannisation, the program of urban renewal that took place between 1852 and 1870. Baron Haussmann, the chief designer for the new city, used a medical vocabulary to describe his planning procedures. So the two forests he created were the lungs of Paris, the sewers, the organs of the metropolis, the streets, arteries, demolitions, surgical incisions. These are all his metaphors. And his efforts to eliminate biological parasites from the city had serious negative effects on the poor. Swathes of working class housing were demolished, and rising real estate prices drove the city's working classes out to the suburbs. Paris's quote unquote social parasites were expelled from the host body and forced to eat outside. Haussmann built on the marriage of social and biological parasites pioneered earlier in the century, and he also began to incorporate media into his hygienic urbanism. The government laid new telegraph lines and created the pneumatic postal service, improvements that reflected a growing sense of the city's function as media system and the need to reduce information loss and improve efficiency within it. But should be said, the noise was not yet really framed in the pathological terminology of parasites. Aimé Boutin writes of this period that there was no clear policy against noise in comparison with intolerance for bad smells, smoke, mud, overcrowding, factors more closely associated with sanitation and health. So while in the 1850s and 60s, the biological, social, and mediatic overlap in more ways than they did in the previous half century, they're not quite pathologized with the same vocabulary. But the end of the 19th century began to change that. Paris's planning was shaped by hygiene-minded architects like Louis Bonnier and Henri Sauvage. New policies gave the Public Health Council the ability to deny planning permission. Medical professionals had to approve certain demolitions. Large-scale social housing construction in the 1880s was done in partnership with hygienic societies. And alongside this, mediatic parasites were beginning to enter the public health equation more and more. The hygienist Fonsagrive believed that domestic space was inadequately sheltered from noise, and he succeeded in changing the thresholds of intolerance and making noise control and abatement more of a priority for citizens and city governments. And this is also roughly the period when Parasite enters the Larousse dictionary with the meaning noise. I think that's 1907. So it's at this stage that I think you can really start to talk about anti-parasitic urbanism in Paris. By the early 20th century, you have this consensus among architects and urban planners that the city is simultaneously a living organism and a media system, and that the responsibility of planners is to protect its health and optimize the transmission of information through it. And these ideas are, sometimes consciously, sometimes accidentally, intertwined with a desire to expel the poor from buildings, from neighborhoods, from the city as a whole. Just end this urban historical portion of the talk by saying some words about Le Corbusier and the architects of the modern style in the 20th century, who in my view represent the apotheosis of anti-parasitic urbanism. When Serres compares Descartes in Le Parasite to an architect who sets his house on fire to kill the rats, I think he could have just as easily been writing about Corb. Le Corbusier married hygienics to a total aversion to noise and a faith in technology's ability to insulate the individual from the outside world. He once wrote in language that sounds to me both biological and carceral, quote, "When it comes to urbanism, one can consider the apartment like a cell. In general, we feel free in our cell. and we dream of living in a detached house somewhere to guarantee that freedom. Reality has shown that putting cells together is an attack on freedom, end quote. So it's only by placing yourself in a kind of permanent quarantine that your health can be guaranteed. Korb was militantly opposed to noise, which he called a sickness that would reduce humans to termites. The home would need to become a noise insulator. In Vers une architecture, he writes, "It is the architect's task to bring the surfaces that envelop these volumes to life without their becoming parasites that consume the volume and absorb it to their profits." Very enigmatic, striking use of parasite in that context. So the architect has to create walls that will keep out parasites. Le Corbusier developed a proprietary system of honeycombed glass to block out noise, which he installed in his own office. And he encouraged the adoption of technologies like the gramophone and player piano as a way to simultaneously regularize the soundscape of the home and safeguard oneself from the diseases spread in shared spaces like streets and concert halls. Korb called his homes machines for living in, and he encouraged residents to become machine-like to inhabit them properly. As Mark Perelman puts it, he, quote, removes the body from the interior as a way of de-inhabiting the apartment, end quote. So the pathogenic human body that is the precondition for disease disappears from the home and hygiene is achieved. Now, if you are unlike the situationist Ivan Chekhov, who wrote, and I love this quote, "The Le Corbusier model is the only image that arouses in me the idea of immediate suicide. He is destroying the last remnants of joy and of love, passion, freedom." And you would like some more arguments against this anti-parasitic urbanism. Well, as was highlighted by a trio of books published in 2015, Korb's hygienics is probably more accurately described as eugenics. He was a Vichy sympathizer and proud anti-Semite who worked as technical advisor to Alexis Carrel's Eugenics Institute. And I agree with Perelman that Le Corbusier's personal beliefs can't be dissociated from his work. On the contrary, his architectural and urbanist theories implement his political beliefs. For example, his modular system of architectural proportions, which he came to treat as something like a personal religion, placed the standard man at the heart of design. The body in question was a 6-foot-tall athletic male. The modular is but the most direct example of how a fundamentally exclusive idea about the kinds of bodies the city is for sits at the heart of Le Corbusier's designs. His determination to insulate the standard man from the parasitic influences latent to collective life is inextricable from ethnic, cultural, and biopolitical questions about who is allowed to inhabit the city. And this is not just an issue with Le Corbusier personally. The eugenic beliefs into which his hygienics elided had widespread currency in French architectural circles even after the Second World War. One of the most important texts in post-war French urbanism was Jean-François Gravier's Paris and the French Desert, published in 1947. Gravier calls big cities parasites that devour the resources of the nation, and he too turned sanitary arguments into ethno-nationalist ones, describing immigrants as barbarian invaders and those from the Middle East as, quote, unassimilable and devoted to parasitism. Like Le Corbusier, he had strong ties to the Vichy government and to the Carrel Foundation. And his book was the Bible of French planning doctrine throughout the de Gaulle and Pompidou presidencies, which is a span of over 25 years. I think we continue to see the legacy of this kind of thinking in, for example, Chirac's noise and odor speech, or Nicolas Sarkozy's promise to clean out the Paris suburbs with a power washer, or more recently, the far-right politician Serge Fedebouche's comparison of refugee camps to rubbish heaps and his accusation that refugees had reintroduced pertussis to Paris. I don't have time to go into all the details, but if you're familiar with Roberto Esposito's work on immunity, and in particular, his argument that a kind of self-destructive fascism is the inevitable telos of the desire to immunize the self from the contagion of the other, I think that applies here, and I think it is essentially accurate as concerns Le Corbusier's connection to eugenics. So in summary, Serres' Parasite allows us to see how informatic techno-utopian approaches to urbanism are in fact profoundly intertwined with hygienic and eugenic ideologies that have exerted influence on urban planning since its emergence as a discipline. And I think it helps us not to lose sight of the marginalized other, the unwelcome guest, whose suffering is bound up in the desire for clean, orderly, peaceful cities. So with the time remaining, I would like to consider another side to the story, which is parasitism as a mode of contesting urban space. So self-parasite has a kind of agency, despite remaining outside of the subject position, and self challenges the negative connotations of parasite. In a city where politics has almost always been thought in terms of the empowered center and the disenfranchised periphery, I think Serres' parasite who gets power less because he occupies the center than because he fills the environment seems to offer opportunities to renegotiate urban power dynamics. So in the book, I offer several case studies of parasitism as a way of contesting urban space, and I'm just going to describe a couple too very briefly. The first is street art and graffiti. So these are often vilified by critics as something dirty, diseased, plague-like, and it's notable that some of the most prominent artists have appropriated that characterization. Blek le Rat explained his choice of pseudonym and signature by saying, rats are kind of like wild rebels. They scare people and they bring plague to the people. They are a pathogen element and they spread the plague everywhere, just like street art. And this is how he wants to think of himself. Another French artist, Invader, describes his work as a computer virus that has somehow found its way into the real. Their art is parasitic in multiple senses, I think. So Blek's stencils of homeless figures surrounded by rats create a parallel between the pathologization of rats as biological parasites and the vilification of those who cannot pay their way in the city. Invader encourages his fans to make their own versions of his work, which I think makes the work into a kind of quasi-object that can be circulated amongst a community rather than a message disseminated by an individual subject. Street art in general creates noisily palimpsestic walls and is a kind of mediatic parasite. Serres writes, given two stations in a channel, they exchange messages. If the relation succeeds, if it is perfect, optimum, and immediate, it disappears as a relation. If it is there, and if it exists, that means that it failed. So he's getting at the fact that parasitism disrupts immediacy, drawing your attention to channels that might otherwise be invisible. And I think street art does just this, as with the boy in this image. And in the process, it opens to contestation the subliminal messages that pass through the urban fabric. Graffiti can also transform messages written by others, making it possible to prevent corporations and governments from transmitting the messages they hope to transmit. And lastly, I would say that Serres' writing is also useful for understanding the growing institutionalization of street art. His reading of Bourseau's fable of the city rat and the country rat, which ends with the tax collector jumping to the last position and becoming the parasite of the rats, accurately describes, I think, the co-optation of street art by the corporations and municipal governments it once antagonized, and it discourages too utopian a reading of it. Another case study in the book is walking and urban exploration as a way of challenging cartography's claims to order space and make it visible. So quickly, some examples include Situationist International's attempts to disorient themselves in what they saw as a too utilitarian city, Philippe Basset's exploration of the blank spaces of the police map of Paris to discover what exactly the police can't see, or Jacques Reda's attempt to walk along the Paris Meridian as a sort of tongue-in-cheek tribute to Oulipo, an experiment that results in what he calls the revanche du flou, the revenge of the fuzzy, a demonstration that there is always a gap between the city and its geometrization. I think these parasitic destabilizations of the map accomplish a few things. In Basset's case, the blank spaces tend to be occupied by houseless people and migrants who have constructed shanty towns, suggesting that the limits of police surveillance create zones for the so-called parasites of the city to create alternate models of community. Reda's rigid adherence to his rule brings to light the arbitrary privatization of urban space as he repeatedly encounters and disregards do not enter signs with echoes of right-of-way protests like the mass trespass of Kinder Scout. Beyond these tactical effects, by bringing the flou back into the city, these experiments encourage us to make space for what Jacques Derrida and Jean-Luc Nancy call the à venir, two words, the unexpected, the unpredictable, the uninvited. And then I'll just conclude with this last point by saying that this last point about the à venir, by raising the question of what kind of disposition we as citizens and as urban planners ought to adopt, leads us from the question of what parasitism offers as a mode of resistance to the question of what an alternative to anti-parasitic urbanism might look like. So I end the book by discussing Derrida's failed collaboration with Peter Eisenman. on a garden in the Parc de la Villette. And it's possible that a parasitic architecture is a paradox in a similar way to a deconstructive architecture. But there is a building that I think responds to this question in its own mediocre way. In 2016, Paris held a competition inviting architects to submit radical proposals for a set of plots owned by the city. The most interesting, in my opinion, was this design by XTU Architects. So it's a proposal for 3 towers, one integrating trees, one plants, and one algae, each containing housing for students and researchers, as well as an interdisciplinary research center overseen by chance by the Centre Michel Serres. And then there would be a 4th building housing earthworms. So I don't actually know how the Centre Michel Serres came to be associated with the proposal, but the association doesn't seem that inappropriate to me. The structure in many ways welcomes parasites with its subsidized housing, walls that are biomes rather than barriers, and the hospitality it offers to the quintessentially insignificant non-human organism of the worm. By the time construction began, however, the plans had significantly changed. So gone is the algae house, gone the earthworm house, gone the student accommodation and research center. What is left are greenwashed luxury flats. And so this building is very disappointing. But I think like the fragmented plans that Derrida and Eisenman left behind for their non-existent garden, it does provide us a glimpse of a city that does not reflexively pathologize its parasites, that makes space for noise, for the poor, for non-human life. Thank you.
Presentation, consider a book sold, right? I want to push a bit, hear your thoughts on the simple question. The simplest way to pose the question is what's wrong with parasitism in that sense? And I mean, so there are certain evaluative terms that define in your talk. That kind of parasitism is problematic. Maybe others are better. And I'm just wondering, what is the difference? Why are some forms of parasitism better than others, or parasitism is the prediction that that's also an option?
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like the question of that question that we are posing: what can we do with Serres politically? And one option that seems to have echoes in your talk is very kind of Foucauldian, Deleuzian way of, he just offers you a toolbox for local resistance or something, and then you can ask the typical question, but yeah, what's wrong with, not with discipline, but with parasitism in that sense? Because there is a kind of danger that you smuggle in other values, or we all like diversity, we all like this, and actually that's the values doing the political work. Whereas if you would not share these values, then you would not, well, then you would have completely different conclusions based on that statistic logic that you apply. How do you see that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are different sides to it. So I think that kind of diagnostically, the parasite as a framework. So I think it is useful for capturing, what I like about it, among other things, is this instability, that the parasite isn't a kind of stable position that you can occupy, but that it's always in motion. That this briefly it's the city rat, then it's the country rat, then it's the tax collector, then it's the rats again. And I think that describes, in the case of something like street art, how within a certain context, within a certain, when there's a certain kind of repression about what kinds of messages can pass through the city, then it can be productively defiant to take advantage of this noise. To be the noise that can't be kept out of the system. It does maybe provide an avenue for those denied access to urban media channels, typically to kind of force their way in through this other door. But that it's not a kind of, that Microsoft can just as easily be parasite as, you know, the poor artist kind of thing. So I think that's useful in terms of describing shifting power relations. And then there's, I think, the second question of the defense of a certain groups that, that, as I said, have kind of historically been stuck with the parasite label, and a more polemical defense of their right to the city. And I don't know, I'm kind of fine with, I think what I'm saying is that I am not identifying them as parasites, that there's a kind of like urban hegemony that is calling them parasites, and that I'm trying to defend, to argue that we owe an ethical duty to the parasite, even if they don't bring anything positive to the city. That it's kind of like change in the way you think about what the right to the city means, or maybe a kind of return to what Lefebvre says in Le Droit à la Ville, is it's a kind of fundamental right that you don't have to earn. Is that a response to the question, or am I missing what you're saying?
Yeah, no, I don't know what to think about my
yeah.
And I mean, following that, so following say, you could say it's always a question not of eradicating parasites, but of exchanging parasites. Whenever you try to eradicate, other new parasite slips in, or you're yourself other parasite, something like that. Well, if you accept that point of view, then in that sense, you can call the poor, etc., parasitic without necessarily have that kind of moral connotation, because everything is parasitic. And then the question is, why are certain transformations of the city deemed valuable in your view and others are not? Where does that normative aspect come from?
Okay.
And
yeah.
And the question mainly, is that linked to Serres, or is Serres?
I think that's not from Serres. I think Serres is more in the, because these moments in Le Parasite where he says, yeah, it can completely transform the system, or it's just kind of immunity and it gets absorbed. I mean, there's a kind of, you do run into that static dimension. And I think I was initially drawn to Le Parasite thinking in terms of authoritarian context, and for instance, there's a case in Cairo around Tahrir Square where at some point they built stone barriers to blockade people, to keep them out of Tahrir Square so they wouldn't be able to demonstrate anymore. And then the next day there was this kind of street art campaign to do this trompe-l'œil intervention to show the square on the other side of the wall as a way of drawing attention to the wall, while also providing this kind of utopian dream of being able to cross it. And I think something like that seems quite, I was initially kind of attracted to that as a way of responding to authoritarianism, that you can always, there's always a way back into the channel. And then I think I probably at some point hit a dead end with Serres, feeling that it actually really isn't, once you kind of get to the next stage, then the people that you were trying to overthrow are just behind you and they're taking advantage of you. I think I probably come to the more prescriptive side of it through Derrida and through his understanding of hospitality, where there's a more, where what's the issue is more of how do you welcome the person who doesn't deserve the welcome at all? How you the parasite in this kind of original hospitable sense of the person who doesn't really deserve to be at the meal. What kinds of, how do you prevent them from suffering this violence that seems structural to the meal in general, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm asking exactly the same question now, but maybe I try to shift it in a bit of a different way, because yeah, I find it extremely interesting that you're leaning on the on this notion or this meaning of this parasite, which stresses the excludedness and not so much the kind of, because I think that also comes up in the natural contract, that like the contract is also a limitation of parasitical action. So there's also this very clear idea of well, we need to limit parasitism because from a certain perspective, I mean, this is also very perspectival, it seems. And you introduced that, I think, with the noise. Yeah, from a certain perspective, this is like what grounds his idea of a contract. So I'm wondering how to deal with it a bit from a kind of, from the theoretical perspective, because yeah, as you said also, who the parasite is shifts, and it depends on the perspective you take. And now, when you turn it into a political concept, is it that you already have something in mind, such as like a kind of leftist politics that wants to include the poor into the city, and that has like a very specific idea of like what kind of seemingly parasites are good and what seemingly parasites might be bad, and then just uses the parasite as an addition to what is actually already decided, or whether you think we can start from the idea of a parasite.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure where to begin. I think so. One of the things that I find, I'm not sure if this will get to an answer to your question. I think that one of the areas in which the idea of the parasites seems quite useful to me is in thinking about contemporary street protest, where if you think of movements like Occupy and Nuit Debout and etc., there's this desire for a kind of flat hierarchy, relational subjectivity, no leader. There's these kind of quasi-objects in the form of like a people's microphone, or these ways in which the voice is kind of circulated through the group without one voice becoming dominant. And so that seems to kind of fit with this idea that Serres has of the ball game, and we're always passing. This is a power that you can only exercise by handing it off to somebody else. But there's also, like, as a case study, I found it very interesting that Nuit Debout, despite on principle being kind of open to all forms of discourse and being founded on this Republican tradition of contestation and open debate, that somebody like Alain Finkielkraut was like categorically exposed from the discourse. And I actually don't mean to kind of prejudge this as a leftist politics. I think that there's something problematic in that desire to have a group that doesn't have a leader, and where everybody passes subjectivity around, and where everybody can play, and you don't kind of judge how other people are playing the ball, but also somehow setting up the game so that you get the rhetoric that you wanted from the beginning. Maybe coming back to this question of whether Serres is a democratic thinker, I think that that's part of that tension. So I don't mean to kind of set it up so that you end up with democratic liberalism. But then I think there's a separate issue of the kind of structural violence of the ways in which parasites are treated within this kind of meal format. And as I said, I think that's more along the lines of Derrida and the hostility that is reserved for the barbaros. And I'm okay with trying to mitigate or manage that violence and take the side of the parasite in that equation. Is that responsive?
Thank you. That was a really lovely paper with such wonderful buildings. I really, it's almost at a tangent, I suppose, but I'm going to lift straight from Serres, kind of reductio ad absurdum, with respect to how it might be possible to go about reducing noise, or indeed eliminating noise. And what he said is that for noise to be eliminated, the receiver must be the emitter. So whatever transmits must also receive immediately. There must be no duration in the message, which of course means, I mean, that really is a reductio, because you get rid of space altogether. And of course, he's not suggesting that that is a desirable state of affairs. He's not suggesting that we should try to do that, but effectively, perhaps that's what our Paris cups are in by Serres' framework. That's what they must really have to do if they are going to get done what they want to do. But that would be to pretty much collapse space and time on itself. So we don't want that. But what he is doing there is saying that that is the immediate and automatic and axiomatic cost of any message that there will be, there will be noise and the parasite following on from And in that sense, there is a very much a sense that whatever attempts you do to accommodate are ever going to be really quite partial, really quite mitigated, if judged by that standard. And so that is nothing more than that. It's a reductio ad absurdum, but I wonder how, I just thought I'd throw it into the mix and see what you thought.
Yeah. Yeah, so it makes me think of two things, which might also be just my brain still processing the previous question. There's a line in, there's a passage in Zeynep Tufakci's book, Twitter and Tear Gas, where she says something like, in the olden days, governments censored speech, and now they've learned that you just have to flood the channel with noise, or as Steve Bannon puts it, flood the zone with shit.
And the Bauman, same.
Yeah. And so it's a kind of, I think that's another dimension to it is, like if you think of like Rancière's politics, where you somehow just by miracle create a space for dialogue and the government listens to you. Well, that doesn't work when consciously the response is to just flood the zone with noise. So I think that's another, like, if nothing else, an imperative to thinking about how noise fits into this, that the receiver can just choose to not engage. And there isn't much you can do as somebody petitioning them to manage that in a kind of informatic communicational framework. And as far as managing parasites is always partial, I totally agree. I don't really know what to say about it. I think, you know, the conclusion of talking about this building that didn't get built, or if it's going to get built, is going to suck. When Derrida, there's an interview in Choral Works where I think it's Derrida talking to students at Cooper Union in New York. And I think it's normally read as a kind of like deconstructive play that, oh, you know, I said I was building a building, but actually I was writing a book and the building is just a trace. But he says, like, you know, I realized, like, I would like deconstruction to be affirmative. I would like to actually be able to put it into the world and do something. And I realized, like, I have to make a budget now. I have to get this approved by the district council. And there's something kind of, you know, appealingly pragmatic about that. Like, how much of deconstruction can you actually get into the—
What's the construction budget?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's kind of the, you know, philosophically, there's no way to kind of eliminate parasites from the city, and it would be meaningless to do so. And whether that would have any political content is another question. But there is, there are clear cases of violence that could be addressed and managed, and some progress could be made in that regard.
I think it's wonderful. I'm very interested in the bit where you were the figure of the 10,000 people who die from noise every year, and which is weird, isn't it? But I'm guessing that must be underpinned by some kind of discourse of stress.
Yep, something like that.
Yeah. But, that's sort of the opposite of that. The association of health with silence is really interesting. Part of what the genealogy is of that idea. I do quite a lot of empirical work in psychiatric units, and you absolutely have that discourse that you know, silence, de-escalation is what you want, and that's how you run an effective ward. Whereas for people who are hearing voices, the last thing you want is silence. You want other stuff going on around you to distract from hearing what your voices are saying to you. And bizarrely, it doesn't work out very well for nurses, who often say silence is an indication that something's going on. Silence is a deliberately produced camouflage for something else. So there's almost a kind of a Serres-like sort of middle ground between, you don't want an absolutely noisy ward, but you don't want an absolutely silent ward. It's sort of tuning into what that kind of semiotic sweet spot is between those two kinds of things. And is that something where health lies, in that kind of sweet spot between them?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. I love that comparison. My partner's a psychologist who works with people with psychosis. So yeah, it's a very welcome analogy. I don't think I have anything to add to that. I do think, you know, if they were asked to follow their argument through to its logical conclusion, I mean, essentially what they're banning people from wearing headphones also. I mean, if we really are going to go by this purely decibel definition of noise pollution, it's the actual consequences would be very strange and different from what they're presented as. Yeah, I think that it's somewhere in between some kind of, also maybe an aesthetic change in what people expect from the city, what people value from the soundscape. Thank you.
It's a bit of a suggestion, perhaps, out of curiosity. I would be interested to hear what you think, or whether it matters somehow. But I find it, and I'm also thinking a lot about this. There's a kind of a contradiction almost. I mean, I'm working with architects, so the whole time around the 20s and so on is very important. And it's so common to kind of make what they stand for today. But Le Corbusier was almost 40 years old when the British Planning Act included private sanitary facilities as a minimum for housing. So the question of hygienics was incomparable, no? In the time that they were thinking and acting and planning and so on, to the situation that we have now, where we probably humans certainly in Europe have never lived in more sterile kind of conditions. And yet there is an enormous new interest and preoccupation to kind of well, both, no? The pollution issue and then the tendency to reinvent with smart cities and basically optimize conditions for the climate, for the global values, no? So to implement that. And to me, it feels like maybe we could say the sympathies or the moral inclinations around these issues are extremely confused. And it's a simple story to kind of see a form of activism. But what does it mean today with on the scale on which we are discussing parasitism and smart governance of all the processes? No, so the parasite today is not so much really the hacking of the communication channel. It comes much closer to the. I mean, Serres is talking about the relation between pollution and property and the claiming of it, and this anthropological formula, which I so simple and so striking. No, pollution is matter not in its right place. So in the global circulations, these things have a very different kind of reality, let's say, attached to it. How? So your line kind of went straight from the today appearance of the bad guys to what we should fight when we fight today, namely this kind of tyranny. How I'm sure you didn't mean it so straightforward. Where do you see the real challenges or the subtleties where we need to get smarter with this, or maybe dirtier or whatever?
Where do I see the real challenges? What do you mean by real challenges?
Your interest in the parasitism for urban planning. So street that, yes, but on which scale does it play?
I think, I mean, concretely, so in the Paris context, right? So most recently, there's this, the dominant debate now is the kind of saccage Paris hashtag, and the perception that the city is irretrievably getting uglier and dirtier, and that all kind of green interventions in the city are actually making things uglier, that the city resembles a dump more and more. So I think, and that's connected with migrant policy in so much as an example of Serge Fedebouche, who ran for mayor in the last election. Part of that for him is that there are all of these refugees inhabiting the streets. So I think the kind of aesthetic question of how people perceive cleanliness or dirtiness of the city has quite clear effects in what kinds of ecological interventions they're willing to accept, and also what kinds of ethical, I don't know, how they're willing to relate to the other in the city. So I see it along those lines of kind of challenging the aesthetic expectations of cleanliness, asking people to examine the political biases in this rhetoric of peace and quiet and order and clarity and efficiency. And I think it connects quite directly to things like, I don't know, improving, I don't know, more green spaces, more ecological architecture, more humane treatment of homelessness and migration, these kinds of issues.
But what I mean is the short, there is a certain shortcut, because the cleanliness is precisely what produces green spaces with quiet places and so on. So
I don't know that
the ability and the awareness raising that is often coming with these instruments is fighting for creating that. So
yeah,
that's what I find so complicated to think through.
I think the rhetoric can work both ways. I'm just not sure that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think of something like rewilding, wildlife gardening, that kind of thing, one of the objections you often get is that it's messy, and I don't think that that's. I think that's I'm not sure that clean is necessarily as unproblematically connected to green as that. I think that it's, as you said, the associations are complicated.
Max, thank you.